We are in the month of July, which means the college football season is right around the corner. And I am planning on doing a lot of team previews and season predictions for the college football season. And I am starting off with the Nebraska Cornhuskers, as I always do. Given that Nebraska is my home state, I always like to start off with them. Last year was the first season with Matt Rule as the Nebraska head coach, and it can be best described as a roller coaster of a season as they started off 0-2 last year. In week 1, a loss to Minnesota by one possession as we quickly saw Nebraska continue the old habits that they had under Scott Frost. And then week 2, the very next week, a loss against Colorado in a game where they were in it for most of the way, but turnovers early on in that game is what ruined their chances of winning that game. But then they went on to win 5 out of their next 6 games, with the lone loss in that stretch of the season being to Michigan, who went on to eventually win the national championship. But then in the home stretch of the season, 4 games left, Nebraska just needs to win one more to be bowl eligible for the first time in several years. And they lose their final 4 games of the year by one possession. And week after week in the home stretch of the year, we saw Nebraska continue those old habits that they had under Scott Frost, losing by one possession, not being able to finish games. But it is a brand new season, and Nebraska, they've been getting quite the hype these last few years. And 2024, the hype they've been receiving is the most that I think we've seen from Nebraska in at least since the Bo Pelini days. They are returning 17 starters from last year, 9 on offense and 8 on defense. The 2024 season for Nebraska is centered around freshman quarterback Dylan Raiola, the number 1 quarterback in the 2024 class. And it looked like he was going to be a sure thing to go to Nebraska, but then he was projected to go to Georgia, but then it's announced that Carson Beck is returning for Georgia for one final season. And then a week later, he commits. Actually, not a week later, but later on, he does end up committing to Nebraska. And can Dylan Raiola become the guy that brings Nebraska back? And by the way, I'm not sure if it's Raiola or Rayola. I've heard different people pronounce it a different way. So if you have the confirming of that pronunciation, I do appreciate it. The schedule for Nebraska this season, it does look favorable on paper, but to me, looking at it, it is favorable to an extent. And I say that because I don't think it's as favorable as what a lot of people would make it out to be. And I will explain that once we get to it. But also next year's schedule is favorable as well, and I'm bringing that up as much as I don't like to think about 2025 already. That I do feel like these next 2 years for Nebraska football will set the tone for Nebraska football for the next decade. If Nebraska does really well in these next 2 seasons, next 3 seasons, I really do think it is a strong possibility that Nebraska is going to be back to where they were before. But will they be back to when they were in the 90s? It is hard to say at this point. But these next 2 seasons, it can really provide momentum that this program really needs. And before I get to the schedule prediction, I do want to acknowledge the resigning of defensive backs coach Evan Cooper. As late last week, he just out of nowhere resigns. And we don't know what happened. Is it possible that he got caught in 4K? Nobody truly knows anything. If he did get caught in 4K, there are rumors and speculations everywhere that I'm not going to personally get into. But if people say something in the comment section about it, then they do. I can't control what people comment on here. But they are bringing in John Butler. I'm not sure if he officially got hired, but I do know there was talks of it, as he was the Penn State defensive coordinator in the past. I believe it was in 2013. And he was one of the many personnel that was able to bring Penn State back from the scandal from over a decade ago. And he does have NFL experience as well with the Texans and the Bills. So I would say that this is an upgrade from Evan Cooper. And I really do think that when Tony White inevitably leaves, which I think he's either going to leave at the end of this season or next season, depending on how strong the defense is. And he will be the defensive coordinator after Tony White leaves. And I do feel like this is a very smart hire for Nebraska, as you at least have a defensive coordinator in waiting, because it looked like Tony White was thinking about UCLA, is what the rumors were, or San Diego State, one of those two teams, maybe even both of them. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. But strong hire for Nebraska and John Butler, if that is indeed the hire. Is I don't know if anything's been official yet. But on to what you are here for, and that is the schedule prediction for Nebraska, as I'll be predicting every single game of their schedule. The season begins for the Nebraska Cornhuskers on August 31st against UTEP, and UTEP should be a win. I believe UTEP has not won against a Power 5 opponent in the history of their program. That should be an easy win for Nebraska. The next week, September the 7th, at home against Colorado. And if this was an 11 a.m. kickoff game, I do think that this would be close to 50-50. With this being a night game, I think it's 65-35 in favor of Nebraska. I'm leaning towards a Nebraska win. I've seen some people, I even talked to some people saying that Colorado is going to be an easy win for Nebraska. But I'm not certain at this point. I'd say 65-35 in favor of Nebraska. The next week, at home against Northern Iowa, that should be a win. Next week, December the 21st against Illinois, that should be a win as well. The first road game of the season on September 28th at Purdue, that should be a win as well. The next week, at home against Rutgers, that is the homecoming game, and that should be a win for the Huskers as well. Then after a bye week on the road at Indiana on October 19th, and that should be a win. So it is very possible that Nebraska can be 7-0 going into the matchup on October the 26th against Ohio State. And if Nebraska is 7-0 going into this game, I really do think it's a strong possibility that Game Day will be hosting this game at Ohio State. And I do feel like Nebraska does lose this game, although anything can happen. November 2nd at home against UCLA, I do feel like that is going to be a win. I don't have high expectations for UCLA this season, personally. November 16th at USC, I do feel like that could be a loss for Nebraska. I really do think it really depends on how USC's defense is. I have that as a 50-50 game. Then November the 23rd, Senior Day at home against Wisconsin. And with it being Senior Day, I do think that I'd say 60-40 in favor of Nebraska, maybe 70-30 in favor of the Huskers, given that it is Senior Day. And November the 29th at Iowa to finish off the regular season. And I do feel like that this should be a Nebraska win. I would say 75-25, maybe 80-20 in favor of Nebraska. So looking at this schedule, I did say earlier that to an extent that this schedule is favorable in my opinion, but only to an extent, because Indiana, Ohio State, UCLA, and USC, those 4 games right there, they will all be off of a bye week when they play Nebraska. So 4 straight opponents will have an extra week to prepare for the Huskers. But at least Nebraska will also have a bye week going into the USC game. But looking at this schedule as a whole, the ceiling for Nebraska is really high. I'd say the ceiling is 10-2 with losses to Ohio State and USC or Wisconsin, one of those two. Depending on how Wisconsin looks going to that game, as Wisconsin, they have had Nebraska's number as of late. The floor, which is the worst case scenario, I would say 7-5 as the absolute worst case scenario. But in my overall opinion, as much as I don't want to buy into the hype early on about Nebraska, the schedule just feels too favorable for me to not say they're going to win at least 9 games. I do think that Nebraska wins 9 games, at the very least 8 games, and the 3 losses for Nebraska, I have them being Ohio State, USC, and Wisconsin, which I do think a 9-3 season for Nebraska in Matt Rule's second season, I do think that that would be major progress. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Like, share, comment, and subscribe, and let me know which team you would like me to predict next. Until next time, have a wonderful day or evening whenever you happen to be listening in.